I'm Michael Rault, and I'm the main part of the band called Michael Rault. Oh, that was my old band when I was in high school. This is like a Nardwuar interview. Nobody asked me about the mixed signals. Yeah, it's my band when I was in high school. I put out a few EPs with them, and then eventually just dropped the mixed signals and started doing stuff under just plainly Michael Rault. Way back in the with the mixed signals, I was like tired of my high school bands getting together and then breaking up. And then there was always arguments about like whether you could use the songs you wrote for the band, because it was like that was that band's song, and I was just like tired of it. So I was like, and I was realizing that it was going to happen like every like 5 months or something. So at that point I started doing the mixed signals, and that was kind of a rotating cast of characters behind me. And then ever since I went fully solo, it's been kind of a similar thing. Either like when I was early on, I was doing a lot of solo shows, and then previous to the solo shows, and then subsequently from the solo shows, I started to do stuff with different bands, and I've kind of been rolling through some different lineups, but I've had some stability for the last little while, which is nice. But solo project definitely affords you more flexibility in terms of what you want to do with the project without having to convince a whole group of people about the same, to all think the same way, which takes a long time. Oh, interesting. Was my first gig at a friend's garage? Actually, you know what? I think my very first show was at, maybe it was in Bonnecourt, maybe? It was in somewhere outside of Edmonton, and it was actually a hall show. And it was but I mean, maybe my very first solo, yeah. But anyways, Bonnecourt. I'm going to say Bonnecourt, Alberta. We went out, and then the next day we played this place called the Shark Tank in Edmonton that was like an all-ages punk venue. That was a big deal to us when we were like 15 to play there for the first time. This was before the Mixed Signals. This was a band called the Nightshades. Anyways, that was my very first show in Bonnecourt at a hall show, and we were like rock stars because all the small town kids were like, we were high school kids from Edmonton, and we were like signing $20 bills and stuff for them. It was crazy. It was really weird. So that was my very first show. No, not really, but most things people write in press isn't really true, so that's fine. It was a nice thing to read. I like Elvis, and being called a Garage Rock Elvis is definitely complimentary, but I definitely am. There's a lot of things very different between me and Elvis, so, but it's perfect for a press kit. I like that little statement there. That'll make me sound cool to people, hopefully. Oh, yeah, this guy. Me and him have been talking for a while. It's hard to say from this angle because we like are both kind of very not from a very distinct angle, like looking at the bottom of our jaws, sort of. But he might look a lot like me. I find that this happens all the time, though. Having long hair and a mustache and touring, everybody's continually like, oh, you gotta meet my buddy from the first band. He looks just like you. And I'm just like, he's probably like somewhat skinny and has dark long hair and a mustache, and then he does. We usually don't look that much alike, but everybody thinks it's hilarious, and it becomes a big thing. One time on Halloween, when we played Sioux Falls, North Dakota, some people showed up dressed like me for Halloween, like 4 of them, the whole opening band or something. So that was another variation on the same theme. The mustache and long hair thing gets played on in many ways in the touring experience. It was really different. It's really hard to record to tape because you can't like just patch together bad takes. Before I would just do a bunch of shit takes and put them together into a record, and that was like what all my previous records were just bad takes. But this album was like had to have good takes. There's very few patches because they use an old like late 60s tape machine that doesn't really Adaptone, and it doesn't really patch super fast. And patching in, like if you're like trying to punch in, and punching in on tape's always hard, but this one's particularly like got a little delayed where the record head engages. So to get it clean, so you're not getting it weird and screwing up the other take, you really have to be precise, which means that you try to do that as little as possible. So it was interesting. I had to like play things properly and practice things a lot more before I actually was able to put it down, and that changed the vibe of the record, I'd say. And it was also very live off the floor with the rhythm section before I started overdubbing, so that was very different too. The whole thing was changed by the analog nature of the setup over there. I think I was into a lot of like 70s sort of soft rock stuff, I guess. It was a lot of like Wings, Paul McCartney and Wings, that was a big thing. There's some Todd Rundgren influences in there. Was getting really into Badfinger at some point in the whole thing. The Kinks played into it a little bit, although I wouldn't say they're really soft rock, but like it just introspective, intricate rock. That seemed to be the main influences. Those were a few of the bands that I was listening to at the time. The sleeping thing came up kind of subconsciously. I wrote a couple sleeping themed songs and then found that it started to become a theme. Oh, this bag just keeps coming back. Yeah. The sleeping thing kind of came up on it like sort of just naturally. I have a tendency to write about the sun probably too much, but I think it's kind of interesting that like rock and roll has tended to like be really focused on the sun, and it has a weird sort of pagan sun worshipping thing going on. So I've never shied away from that. But yeah, the sleeping thing was just sort of a natural progression. I wrote the song "Sleep with Me," and then that sort of led into a whole bunch of other ones. I think the last one I wrote was the song called "Sleeping and Smiling," which was kind of a conscious effort to like round out the album and write another song about the sleeping, subconscious, dreaming thing. And after I wrote the record, I started to read some of Jung's philosophy and started to get into all these ideas about the subconscious and stuff like that, and archetypes and things. And so I think it sort of started to shed some light on some of the things that I was kind of playing with, but I'm still very much a layman in terms of psychoanalyzation and the subconscious. But I'm very interested by it, and it turned into an interesting theme for an album, I think. It was, it wasn't that much differently than how I'd made things in the past, because I've always worked with an engineer, or engineer/producer, which Wayne was. I've always worked with somebody else in the studio. It's just oftentimes been me alone in the studio. I guess the difference for this one was we started off with 3 of us in the studio for the bed tracks, and that was the beginning of the record was more people in the studio than I usually have, because it's usually me playing everything, so it's just me and the producer. But once the bass and drums were down, then it became just me and Wayne in the studio again, so it was pretty much what I usually did. I've been a huge fan of Daptone for a really long time, and I wasn't fully aware of Wayne's work until I met him through the King Gizzard guys, and when I went over to a session that they were recording an album with him, and but through working with him, I realized how many things he's done that I've been a fan of. He's been behind the scenes for a long time, doing a lot of crazy stuff. Very talented person. So it was great to be able to work with him. I was a fan of his without being aware that I was a fan of his, and then it was really cool to be working at Daptone, because I've been into that studio since I was. I heard like Amy Winehouse was my exposure, because I wasn't cool enough as like a 12-year-old or whatever to know about all of the underground soul that was happening in Brooklyn at the time. But then it was like quickly found out about Sharon Jones, and then from then I was interested in. I got to open for Charles Bradley early on in his sort of breakout period time years ago, and so I was a fan for a really long time. So getting to go work at the studio was definitely like a completely mind-blowing experience. Just going to the studio when I got invited by the King Gizzard guys long before I was invited to work there was very exciting. It was like very crazy to be like, I'm in Daptone. But then, fast forward a few years and I was like sleeping on the couch in like after sessions and like alone in the dark on the main floor of Daptone, looking around every once in a while being like, this is where I am working / living sort of now. So that was it was definitely a trip. Yeah, it was different. It was different in the sense that I was very much limited. I didn't have my own studio for much of the writing process. I'd been evicted from my place in Toronto, and then moved into some places in Montreal where I didn't really have room to make music loudly. So that was hard. And also I was just really picky and really hard on myself trying to come up with enough material that I thought was strong enough for a record that would, give me a step forward in my artistic progression or whatever you want to call it. So that was like, that was different. But in a way it's kind of the same all the time. You just kind of sit down and try to make up songs and then figure out how to arrange them one way or another. Sometimes it's easier and you have more things at your disposal, and other times you don't. But the core of the process is kind of the same. I don't know if it impacted my writing much, but it definitely was an influence in the sense of feeling like I wanted to try to, get to their level as a live band. I don't know if we have, but I feel like they're one of the best live bands that I've seen. And I've toured with a lot of people and seen a lot of shows, and it's just one of the most like mind-blowing live shows. It's just super overpowering. There's so many of them. We've grown to 5 now, but we're still a ways off from matching their numbers, so we're always shorthanded, but they're nuts. So that was just a huge influence in that regard. And they were really encouraging, and also encouraging of the fact of me, encouraging of the idea of me going to Daptone, so to record my next record, which eventually happened. So in that way, it was also an influence. Yeah, totally. I'm a little stressed because I feel like everything to do with flying with a band is a pain, but I'm excited about getting there. Once everything's set, once we have all our gear figured out in the van and got our tickets booked, but besides that, we got to figure out a bunch of other things. But once we get there, we're playing the shows. I'm excited for it. The shows, we got some cool stuff happening over there when we put out the record. We got some nice little reviews and stuff, so I'm kind of curious to get back there. It's been like 3 years since we were last there, so it's going to be nice to see what it's like this time.